Good day everyone! Today I will show you how I made this art easel that has an adjustable stand and also adjustable holders that can hold your artwork securely in place. Just in case you want to make this yourself, I have provided a cut sheet complete with the different kinds of hardware that you'll need for this project. First, I start out by cutting my two 55-inch pieces. Now, I don't know how I lost footage of the next clip, but I just get a scrap piece of wood and cut it to 3 degrees. Then I use that to mark 12 inches above the leg for my first half lap joint. It's better to use a marking gauge, but for this example, I just marked half the thickness of the board, then use my finger as a straight edge to carry out that line. And now the joint is ready to cut. Here I use my tenon saw to carefully cut those lines down to the point where the joint stops. Then I use my chisel and mallet to rough out the groove and carefully pare it smooth. Next, I do the exact same thing with the other leg, except I flip the marking piece around so your groove will somewhat look like this. To mark out the half laps on the stretcher piece, I insert the stretcher piece into both the leg pieces, then trace out the groove just like this. Next, I repeat that same process, but I use the marking piece to mark 8 inches down the top of the leg pieces. Next, I repeat the same process I did for my first stretcher piece, but this time for my 17.5 piece. Before I glue the pieces together, I just give everything a quick planing, sanding, and I also remove the corners using the plane just so that the edges aren't sharp. Now I glue and clamp the 4 main pieces of my easel. After gluing that together, I saw out my other 55-inch piece, plane it smooth, then proceed to cut half laps in the middle of my stretcher pieces on the easel frame that I've just constructed. After I cut out my grooves, I'll take my 55-inch piece and I'll put it in the groove so I can mark out where the other side of the half lap will be. Then I'll proceed to cutting out and chiseling the half laps. Although my half lap joints are nowhere near perfect, they're good enough for this easel build and they friction fit pretty well. So now it's time to glue and clamp them together. I was supposed to drill a 1/4 inch hole 7.5 inches below the upper stretcher, but I thought I could do it later on. But this just caused some problems down the road and you'll see why later. Next, I cut out my 22 and 6-inch pieces and I smoothened them just like the other pieces. I also round the corners of the 22-inch piece. Next, I will inlay the 6-inch piece to the 22-inch piece for extra support. Next, I bevel the ends of the 6-inch piece at a 45-degree angle. If you notice down the video, I do this to all the 6-inch pieces I make. And this just gives it a smoother look. Now, I'll glue and clamp the 6-inch piece to the 22-inch piece. After that, I cut out another 6-inch piece identical to the previous one I've made. Next, I'll cut a loose-fitting half-lap joint in the center of that 6-inch piece. Now I'll make 2 more 6-inch pieces with the same bevels, except I'm just going to cut a half lap joint on one of them. Now I'll measure, mark, and drill holes in both of the pieces, 1 1/4 inch from the ends and at the center of the width of the piece. Next, I do the same thing to the main canvas holder, also 1 1/4 inch from the ends, except it's 3/4 of an inch from the bottom because you have to take account of the inlay that we made earlier. Also, a little disclaimer, but for my project in specific, I used 5/16 of an inch for the bolts and wing nuts instead of 1/4 inch because I couldn't find any, but it really caused me problems and I recommend sticking to 1/4 inch because 5/16 is just too thick. Here, I marked out the bolt head using a pencil and I'm just gonna cut it out using a chisel, just a shallow hole so that the bolt can grip onto something. Since my bolts are too long, I had to cut them but I did that off camera. This is optional but I used some washers for extra support before putting in my wing nuts. Either way, you're gonna have to disassemble it later to put it on the easel, but I just wanted to see the fit. Here, I am cutting out the 46-inch piece and this will serve as the standing leg for our easel. I will now make a 6-inch mortise 2 inches from the top of the standing leg and this should be able to fit your 1/4 inch bolt. It's better to use a chisel to cut this mortise out, but I tried using a drill just to see what the result will be, and even though it's very messy, it still works. Here I'm cutting out a piece measuring 7.5 inches, then I rip it in half. Now I plane it to the size I want, which is 1/2 inch by 3/4 of an inch. Now I'll use my plane to round the edges. Right now I'll start to attach the stand leg to the easel. This was the problem that I was talking about earlier. As you can see, it's hard for me to drill the hole because my drill won't fit, and the only way I was able to do this was to get the drill bit out and manually drill the hole, even if it took a really long time. But yeah, I just marked this hole 7.5 inches from the top stretcher. Next, I drill holes for the standing leg adjustors, 5/8 of an inch from the ends. I've separated all these little parts and now I'm gonna use some spray lacquer to coat a finish on them after smoothing and sanding them further. After that, I move on to applying my lacquer finish to the main easel. I applied 3 coats to all the parts of the easel. Now it's time for assembly. Just note that the 4 2.5-inch bolts are for the holders and the 2 3.5-inch bolts are for the adjustors. And just like that, your easel is complete. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. To all those who have been watching me for quite some time now, thank you so much for staying even though I don't post that much. And to those new viewers, welcome to my channel. And just a disclaimer, I don't post very often, but whenever I do have a project to work on, I will be sure to share it here. Thank you so much once again, and Merry Christmas everyone!